Good afternoon. Welcome to the webinar, Good Wishes for the Children Rediscovered, Hans Christian Andersen and the launch of Sarah Gooll Putnam's artistic career, with the presentation today by Laura Wasowicz. My name is Nan Wolverton, Director of Fellowships at the American Antiquarian Society and Director of CHAViC, the Center for Historic American Visual Culture, which is hosting today's program. Some of you may be joining us for the first time for a virtual program, so I'd like to offer just a few words of introduction to this institution. The American Antiquarian Society is a national research library of American history and culture and a learned society devoted to exploring, understanding, and sharing the history and culture of this nation before the 20th century. As a library, we collect, preserve, and share the printed word of what is now the United States, portions of Canada, and the Caribbean, and we seek to collect one copy of everything that was printed in these areas pre-1900. Our collections include books, pamphlets, broadsides, children's literature, newspapers and periodicals, manuscripts, sheet music, and graphic arts collections such as prints, maps, photographs, valentines, and trade cards. CHAViC was established as a society to promote the use of visual culture for researchers. In my role as director of CHAViC, I work with each of the curators at the Society to help bring visual resources to the attention of scholars, educators, and the general public. Today, we're going to hear from the Society's curator of children's literature. Her talk will show the important intersection of children's literature and artists, and also how a curator who works with thousands of books in an archive sometimes follows a hunch or curiosity that can lead to enlightening discoveries about the producers of a book, and in this case, also its illustrations. All of this adds new information to our holdings for our readers. Before I formally introduce today's speaker, I'd like to ask my colleague, Amanda Condick, to turn on her camera and just to tell you a few of the logistics about how we're conducting today's webinar.
Thanks, Nan, and welcome everyone. So before we get started, I do have a few notes just on the mechanics of our Zoom webinar format. So for the Q&A portion of this program, we'll be using the Q&A function, which is located on the bottom of your Zoom screen. So if you have any questions for Laura during or after her presentation, please type them in there. And as attendees, you will also have the option to upvote your favorite questions by selecting the thumbs up icon. And we'll get to these questions at the end of the program. The chat function is also open, so feel free to send your comments to all attendees and panelists. And throughout the presentation, I'll also be posting additional links related to the presentation, AAS, and CHAViC. And you should be able to save the chat by clicking the three dots in the chat window. If you have any problems with your visual or audio settings, you can also message me privately in the chat. And finally, I would like to remind everyone that we are recording this program. So for those who could not attend or for those who would like to rewatch it, we'll be putting it on our YouTube page within the few weeks. So that's it. Thank you, Nan. Back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Amanda. And now I'd like to ask Laura to turn on her camera. And just a reminder that we will have some time at the end of Laura's presentation for some Q&A. So you can be thinking about your questions as Laura speaks. I'm very pleased to introduce Laura Wasowicz, who is curator of children's literature at the American Antiquarian Society. In that capacity, she oversees the growth, description, and use of the AAS children's literature collection, comprised of 28,000 American children's books issued between 1650 and 1899. She has written on various aspects of 19th century American children's book publishing, picture book iconography, and child reading habits, including essays published in Radiant with Color and Art, McLaughlin Brothers and the Business of Picture Books, 1858 to 1920, which was published by the American Antiquarian Society in 2018, and Who Writes for Black Children, African American Children's Literature Before 1900, which was published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2017. Laura, please go ahead and share your screen.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Nan. It's just, after 33 years, it is still my great pleasure to work at the American Antiquarian Society. All right, here we go. And I will, let's see, slideshow from beginning. And there we are. All right. For the past 2 centuries, the American Antiquarian Society has not just been the single greatest repository of the American printed word and image issued from the 17th through 19th centuries. It is actually a vibrant community fostering conversation between collectors, librarians, and researchers about the production and distribution of printed artifacts like children's books. And through this ongoing conversation, we sometimes discover the actual people and motivations behind the publication of a book. As a curator, I continually work past my own assumptions and the assumptions of other well-intentioned researchers to discover the actual history of the book in front of me. This image is taken from the cover of a rare collection of Hans Christian Andersen's stories, Hans Andersen's Good Wishes for the Children, interpreted by AAB and SGP, published by the famed Riverside Press in 1873. AAS acquired its copy from the illustrious bookman Benjamin Tighe in 1967, and up until 2010, the identities of the translator AAB and the illustrator SGP remained a mystery. I knew that it was a special book because of its binding. It was in lithographed boards, a binding which is far more fragile than the publisher's cloth that was the common choice for children's books in the 1870s. And the size is unusual. As you can see, it is almost square. It measures 7 by 8 inches. And as you can see from the water stains and the scuff marks, its fragile pictorial paper-covered boards has received some rough treatment along the way. The Riverside Press published Good Wishes for the Children. They also published a trade edition of Andersen's Wonder Stories Told for Children from 1870, so about the same time. And you can see that the size is more rectangular, measuring 5 1/4 by 7 1/4 inches. And it is in a sturdy cloth binding, stamped in gold and in blind, and looks like literally thousands of other children's books and books in general that were published at the time. In 2010, I received a phone call from an AAS member who was about to purchase another copy of Good Wishes for the Children. As it turns out, this copy had an inscription to a Mr. Mifflin, who is George H. Mifflin of the Riverside Press, and signed by what looked like the names Avis A. Bigelow and S.G. Putnam. Now, my AAS friend wanted to know if I knew anything about either of them. Their book dealer had suggested that the illustrator could have been the artist Stephen Greeley Putnam. This question took me to our copy of Who Was Who in American Art. So I think it's a 3-volume encyclopedia of artists, American artist names that came out in the 1990s. Using that, I discovered that S.G. Putnam could have been either Stephen Greeley Putnam, a wood engraver born in 1852, or Sarah Gooll Putnam, a portrait painter who was active in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. In fact, like a lot of entries for women artists in Who Is Who in American Art, they don't get the same birth and death treatment that male artists do because their lives were not as well documented. Both artists exhibited in the late 19th century. Although either artist could have been a likely candidate, I instinctively thought it was the woman because the artist was only identified in the book by initials, which would have been in keeping with the commonly held 19th century belief that women needed to maintain modest anonymity, particularly in the public world of print. Hot on the chase, I searched WorldCat and discovered that Massachusetts Historical Society has the diaries and papers of Boston portraitist Sarah Gooll, G-O-O-L-L, Sarah Gooll Putnam, who was born in 1851 and died in 1912. Reading through the collection description, I found that MHS also has extensive holdings of Miss Putnam's pencil sketches, a fact I found striking given the soft pencil quality of the lithographs found in Good Wishes for the Children. It turns out that Sarah Gooll Putnam was a wealthy Boston socialite who spent most of her life in Boston's Back Bay when she was not traveling in Europe or the American West. She exhibited successfully in Boston, Chicago, and New York with the likes of better remembered male artist John Lafarge. All this information was promising, but not conclusive. I eagerly scanned that collection, that online collection contents guide, and I discovered exactly what I was hunting for. Miss Putnam's photograph of Hans Christian Andersen with the caption, photograph sent to me through Mr. Horace Scudder, April 27th, 1874, within a year of my book's publication. Horace Scudder was the legendary children's book author and the longtime editor for the Riverside Press. With this information in hand, I took a trip to the Massachusetts Historical Society, where I spent a happy day using the fully scanned copy of her illustrated diary, from which this image is taken. Researcher Erin Pipkin made extensive use of the diary in her excellent article published in the Massachusetts Historical Review about Sarah Gould's later career as a portraitist, which provides a fine overview of Putnam's life. And a citation to Pipkin's article is in the chat. Sarah Gooll Putnam was indeed a pioneer. At age 26, she was among the very first class of students enrolled at the newly established School of the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, when it opened in 1877. Before her formal training, she studied privately with Boston artists, including Helen Mary Knowlton, who was among the first group of women to study informally with preeminent painter William Morris Hunt. So Sarah Gooll Putnam's illustrations were published just as formal art instruction for women was becoming a socially acceptable opportunity in Boston. According to Putnam's diary, her work on the Good Wishes project was swift and intense. Between October and December 1873, Putnam created the lithographic illustrations for a translation of Andersen's stories that her friend Addie, not Avis, Bigelow had recently made from the German. The book would be published by Riverside Press, and the proceeds from the sales of the fine press book would benefit Boston Children's Hospital. The details that I found about Addie Bigelow were thin but tantalizing. Born in 1842, she was 31 years old, making her 9 years older than Sarah Putnam. They moved in the same elite social circles, and Addie was a cousin of Marion Clover Hooper Adams, who was herself a photographer before she married famed historian Henry Adams. Apparently, Addie had connections to the publishing world. Putnam writes of how the 6 heavy German limestones upon which she drew the illustrations were delivered to her Boston mansion, and that she drew 6 illustrations on each stone. She received brief instruction at home on how to draw on the stones by a Mr. Frizzell, who also delivered the stones to her. He is described by Sarah Putnam as a protege once of Addie's, and presently working for Boston lithographer John Henry Bufford. Mr. Frizzell is lithographer Samuel S. Frizzell. He lived from 1843 until 1895. A lifelong bachelor of Irish Maltese descent, Frizzell migrated with his parents and numerous siblings from Prince Edward Island in the Canadian Maritimes to Boston. Although he was generationally a contemporary of Addie Bigelow, it is highly likely he was not a member of her elite Boston circle. His boss, John Henry Bufford Jr., his dates are 1841 to 1893, was the son of pioneer Boston lithographer John Henry Bufford Sr., whose work dominated Boston print publishing until his death in 1870. Putnam breathlessly describes the lithographic process in which she drew on a stone using a grease pencil, how the stone is then immersed in acid to eat away everything but the grease drawing, and then how the grease is washed off and printer's ink put on in its place and the images printed. Alas, the details of the process are actually a lot more complicated and time-consuming. My AAS colleague and dear friend, Lauren Hughes, provides a more complete description. Quote, "A drawing is made using a grease pencil. The porous limestone is then wiped with amino acids to bond the drawing to the surface, then flooded with water to fill the uninked portions of the stone. When the stone is inked, the greasy lithography ink sticks to the original drawing and is repelled by the water-filled portions of the surface, and the images can then be printed." Unquote. It is likely that Sarah did not directly witness much in the process beyond the initial step of drawing the image, because the heavy stones would have to be literally carted back to the shop for the multi-step application of noxious chemicals and periods of waiting for the images to be chemically fixed onto the stone and then printed. And I have had posted in the chat the link to a really good short YouTube video demonstrating this multi-step process of lithography. It's really good. Check it out. The basic takeaway is that the lithographs are printed separately from set type, in this case, in a different shop, a different building, thus making this book more expensive to produce than a book using wood engravings, which can be easily printed along with set type on the same page. So Good Wishes was indeed a special production produced to draw the patronage of Addie's and Sarah's socialite peers, which apparently it did. Good Wishes for the Children is illustrated with 36 plates by the 22-year-old Sarah Gooll Putnam, and that's no mean feat. I mean, that's a lot of plates. And they exemplify her training as a genteel lady artist and her own personal drive to push the envelope on expected norms at the time for children's book illustration. Aaron Pipkin observes, quote, "In their amateur art, young ladies concentrated on the production of small-scale pencil, pen and ink, or watercolor sketches that they could exchange with friends," unquote. And these illustrations indeed have an intimate scale. They are drawn within a circular area measuring between 3 and 6 inches in diameter, giving us the feel of an intimate gaze through a telescope. This stunning image of Andersen's Little Match Girl uses the soft charcoal pencil quality of lithography to great effect. The barefoot match girl is captured in movement, walking alone on the city street. The bright street light and pedestrians are far away, far removed across the street, emphasizing the impoverished girl's alienation from the warmth of home, family, and friends. Snow flutters everywhere, adding a poignant sense of delicacy to the scene. Upon examination of this image, my colleague Lauren Hughes pointed out that this snow effect was achieved by flicking off bits of the black ink with a gravure, a practice commonly found in European lithographs, and the Buffered office would be totally skilled in that sort of technique. Addie Bigelow's translation sums up the Little Match Girl's dire situation directly and compellingly. Quote, "It was frightfully cold. It snowed and was already nearly dark and evening, the last evening of the year. In all this cold and darkness, there went along the street a poor little girl with bare head and feet. True, when she left home, she had slippers, but of what good were they? The little girl lost them as she scampered across the street because 2 carriages were dashing along at such a terrible rate," unquote. You can see the departing wheel of one of the carriages on the left. Note that in her illustration, Putnam maintained the bare feet, but gave the girl a hood, its swaying conveying a sense of the cold wind about her, and bestowing upon her the look of a wayward urban Madonna. In comparison, this is a depiction of the Little Match Girl taken from the Andersen collection, A Christmas Greeting, published in 1848. This wood-engraved frontispiece is the only image illustrating the entire book. The forlorn match girl is seated on a snowy stoop alone, as if in prayer. The scene is almost entirely still, except for the smoke curling from her little fire of matches down on the bottom right. The upper frame depicts a little doll image on a lit Christmas tree, perhaps symbolizing the match girl's eventual ascension to her grandmother's embrace in heaven. It is a nice image, but does not have the compelling sense of urgent poverty and alienation found in Putnam's snowy version. Despite the pathos of the doomed little match girl's situation, eventually she freezes to death while envisioning images of the hearth, home, and the loving grandmother denied her in life. Putnam injects a bit of humor into this picture of the match girl, peeking into a home handsomely outfitted for the Christmas holiday, including a generously proportioned goose on the dining room table. The girl dreams that she sees the goose stuffed with apples and prunes, hop off the table and waddle up to greet her. Putnam puts the goose in the picture, and we see it hopping off the table to the bemused surprise of the match girl. And this really is in keeping with Andersen's text. As the freezing match girl breathes her last, the spirit of her beloved grandmother takes her up to heaven. Putnam casts the match girl as a biblical visionary, veiled and reaching for the heavenly light. Ironically, Putnam writes in her diary that several of her young, very wealthy, elite Bostonian friends modeled for the illustrations, including Eddie Bigelow's brother, Albert. Putnam really pushed the creative envelope in her treatment of Andersen's story, The Darning Needle, which is a fable about a narcissistic darning needle who thinks that she holds a higher social status than she actually does. As a point of reference, here is an illustration for The Darning Needle published in an 1865 collection of Andersen's tales. This sole illustration for the story is straightforward, but frankly not very exciting. The needle's mistress, a simple cook, turns the darning needle into a breastpin after the needle is broken while mending the cook's slipper, which we see cast off to the side. Like many illustrations for children's books at that time, the image is static, and fine details, namely the darning needle itself, is lost in the larger image of the cook tidying herself up in her kitchen. In Putnam's treatment of the story, the cook's hands are disembodied, staying true to Andersen's text as the needle's masters. We have a telescopic view of the hand sticking the needle into the cook's slipper, which looks very rough indeed, and we can imagine that the needle will break momentarily, which it does. The needle speaks of the thread as her train and denounces the slipper mending as vulgar work. Eventually, the broken needle, which was repurposed by the cook into a breastpin, falls to the ground and is lost among street trash. She makes friends with a bottle stopper, who she assumes must be a diamond because it glitters in the sun. Putnam composes the image in classic still life fashion, with a crumpled piece of newspaper in the background and the needle lying atop the bottle stopper, giving the sense of a third dimension. Eye-fooling trompe-l'oeil still life compositions were painted by the Dutch masters of the 17th century, and the medium would enjoy a renaissance in post-bellum America through the work of American painters William Harnett and John F. Peto, both of whom were among the same generation as Putnam. Here we see a trompe-l'oeil print, Dipper Missing, by Darius Cobb, a staff lithographer for the Boston firm of Louis Prang. We see the elements of a soldier's equipment hung up on a door. The paper scrawled with the note, Dipper Missing, is tacked to the door, again adding a sense of the third dimension. Unlike Cobb's still life, Putnam's collage is not meant to fool the eye into believing that the scene is real. She puts comic faces on the trash, the bottle stopper, and our heroine, the needle. Putnam is at her most creative when she disembodies the cook's hand to illustrate the proud needle's description of the 5 brothers of her employer, the Finger family. The sketch is true to Andersen's humorous text. The outside one, the thumb, was short and thick. He said that if he were cut off, his owner would be too maimed for service. Sweet Tooth, the next finger, used to stick into all the sweets and sours. Longman, the third, looked at all the others over his shoulder. Gould sides the fourth went about with his gold belt on, and little Peter Playman didn't do the first thing and was proud of that. In fact, it was bragging from beginning to end, so I left them, unquote. Putnam infuses each finger with its separate personality. The illustration has the look of practice sketches for a larger work assembled together as one composition, divorcing the viewer from a direct relationship to the assembled hand and the hand's mistress, the cook. In fact, we never actually see the cook embodied as a whole figure in any of Putnam's illustrations for this story. Eventually, some boys pick up the needle and stick it into a broken eggshell. Blackened by the grit of the street, the proud needle pathetically admires her new home of white walls. A passing cart destroys most of the eggshell, leaving the needle behind, lying atop the shards of her short-lived home. Here, again, Putnam's skill as a vignette artist is shown to great effect in her attention to the details of the needle with the broken eye and the contours and textures of the cracked eggshell, putting visual focus upon the needle and her plight in ways that had not been done before in American versions of that story. According to Putnam's diary, the special gift edition of Good Wishes for the Children was well received by members of her social circle who paid for copies of the book and by the publishing community at large. Her diary sports a periodical or newspaper clipping from a review of the book published on January 1st, 1874, which offered cautious praise. Quote, "The drawings are bold sketches, but in most instances they suggest the sentiment of the story very fairly. The delicately tinted cover will not endure being handled by children who do not wear kid gloves," unquote. Which brings me back to my first observation of the book as not meant for common use by real children. The review also mentions that the book was currently for sale by Boston bookseller Noyes, Holmes and Company, thus alluding to the book's limited presence in the commercial marketplace. Noyes, Holmes and Company was a Boston bookstore used by Riverside Press and its parent company, H.O. Houghton and Company, to distribute some of its publications. Although H.O. Houghton and Company was listed as the holder of the copyright on the verso of the title page for Good Wishes for the Children, the book is not listed among its trade editions of Hans Christian Andersen anthologies and contemporary publishers' advertisements. Good Wishes was indeed a special edition, likely underwritten by wealthy backers within Putnam's and Bigelow's social sphere. And I'm really assuming that Messrs. Houghton and Mifflin really did the press work gratis. And the targeted audience was undoubtedly Boston's wealthy elite. Putnam mentions in her diary that, quote, "Mr. Amory gave us $20 towards our book," unquote. And that is a value of about $400 in today's money. And that, quote, "Miss Brewer said that Mr. Brewer would take 10 copies of our book," unquote. For a sense of context, in 1871, Hurd and Houghton issued a trade edition of Andersen's Wonder Stories Told for Children with wood-engraved illustrations by Mary L. Stone and Wilhelm Peterson. And it's this book that I showed, right? The humbler thing. That sold at retail for $2.25, which would be about $45 in today's money. Wood engravings were far cheaper to produce than lithographs for book illustrations because lithographs required a special press separate from that used for set type. This special edition of Good Wishes with its 36 leaves, so 36 pages of lithographed plates, suggests a production cost of, I don't know, perhaps triple, maybe, the trade edition, if not more. The book review for Good Wishes does not list a price, reflecting the fact that if you had to ask the price, you likely could not afford it. As we look at this elegant private edition, it would be easy to forget that the reason for its production was at least in part grounded in the economic misery endured by many Americans in the winter of 1873-74. The country was in the middle of what was then called a panic, what we would now call a severe recession. To make matters worse, Boston Children's Hospital, then only 4 years in existence at the time, was running a deficit, probably due to lower donations and greater need. The report of managers for 1873 concludes, quote, "We do not believe that such an institution would willingly be let die for want of a few $1,000s per annum," unquote. So the Andersen picture book project, spearheaded by these young socialites, was rooted in responding to an immediate call for charitable aid. Indeed, Sarah Putnam and Addie Bigelow were lauded for their efforts by the executives of the Riverside Press. Upon the book's publication, Mr. Houghton gave them a personal tour of the press. At the close of the tour, Putnam writes that, quote, "Mr. Houghton gave us each a book and took us to his house. Soon a sleigh was brought to the door and Addie and I were driving home in style," unquote. Now, this scene, charming as it is, leads to some uncomfortable observations. Illustrator and translator are treated more as privileged guests in the publishing world than ambitious young artists who have something truly creative to offer the marketplace. In search of Sarah Gooll Putnam and Addie Bigelow, I delved into the AAS's truly first-rate collection of secondary literature. I discovered that AAS has a copy of the Andersen Scudder Letters, published in 1941. Sure enough, I found the following passage in a letter from Riverside editor Horace Scudder to Hans Christian Andersen, dated January 15th, 1874. I've put the text up on the screen. "I sent you a little book which has a history. It is entitled Hans Andersen's Good Wishes for Children. These two young ladies, Mrs. Bigelow and Putnam of Boston, wish to contribute something in aid of the Children's Hospital, a very worthy and humane institution in Boston. We printed the book for them, and I begged them to let me send you a copy with their autographs. It would give me very great pleasure if I might be the means of securing for them one of your valued letters with photographs. They are not professional author and artist, but ladies in refined society," unquote. So note how Scudder couches his description. They are two young ladies who are using their talent to benefit a charitable institution, one of the very few public activities allowed genteel American ladies at the time. He calls them young ladies, something akin to children, although Addie Bigelow herself was 31 at the time and on the later edge of marriageable age. Finally, he describes them not as professional with worldly ambition, but refined ladies who have no underlying interest in artistic achievement or economic success. Ultimately, Sarah and Addie navigated this narrow path between culturally acceptable refinement and artistic achievement with varying degrees of success and happiness. It seems that the Bigelow-Putnam partnership was a marriage of convenience. I did not find that Addie remained an active presence in Sarah's life after the publication of Good Wishes. Sarah Gooll Putnam went on to study at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts and enjoyed a successful career as a portraitist, whose clientele were her Brahmin peers. In her essay on Putnam's career as a mature artist, Erin Pipkin makes the great observation that Putnam immersed herself in elite society activities, which could easily at times be a full-time occupation, to prove herself as a social equal of unquestioned virtue and aesthetic taste among potential portrait clients. She was known for capturing the essence of her subjects' personalities in a beneficial way, but deliberately shied away from the provocative poses favored by her artistic and social contemporary, John Singer Sargent. Here is an image of her portrait of the young Amy Lowell as an 18-year-old debutante. It is a far cry from well-circulated images of the poet in rotund middle age. Putnam's casting of Lowell as a seated young woman in a debutante's white dress would have pleased Lowell's conservative parents who commissioned the portrait. However, her pervasive use of shadow veiling more than half of Lowell's face captures the sense of a young woman in the process of becoming an exquisite presence that we want to discover. The sideways view and use of shadow harken back to Putnam's evocative portrayal of the match girl in Good Wishes. True to the social and career path that she so carefully crafted, Sarah Gooll Putnam never married, devoting her life to her family, her art, and maintaining her high social standing. She died in 1912. Addie Bigelow did not fare as well. In 1882, she suffered a nervous breakdown and was committed to a mental institution in nearby Somerville, a plight that deeply troubled her cousin, the photographer Marion Hooper Adams. According to Adams' family historian, Paul C. Nagel, upon hearing the dreadful conditions at that sanitarium in Somerville, Marion, quote, begged her father to do what he could to save Addie Bigelow from confinement, but he could not, unquote. Marion herself would eventually succumb to mental illness 3 years later by committing suicide. Using census records available on Ancestry.com, I tracked Addie Bigelow through the 1910 census. By 1890, she had returned to Boston and was listed as the head of her residence along with several servants. For at least the last 5 years of her life, she maintained an active social schedule of charitable and cultural events in keeping with her status as a member of the Boston elite. In December 1911, she attended a night at the opera wearing a matron's gown of black satin and chiffon with touches of white. An article from the Boston Journal dated February 1st, 1915, lists her as one of the patronesses of a talk given by archaeologist Langdon Warner at the Chilton Club for the Calhoun Colored School, an Alabama industrial school for African American children and youth inspired by Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute. So she kept involved in charitable causes until literally the end of her life. Addie Bigelow died of appendicitis March 18th, 1915 in Boston. Besides being active in her Episcopalian parish of the Church of the Advent, Isabella Stewart Gardner was also a parishioner. She was active in charitable work and retained memberships in the Daughters of the American Revolution and the Massachusetts Society of Mayflower Descendants. She died intestate, leaving an estate valued at the formidable sum of $80,000, which holds a current value of about $1.6 million. These skeletal details allude to a talented and socially well-connected woman whose privileged status did not ultimately save her from intellectual frustration and mental illness. And I should add, she did not translate Andersen's stories directly from Danish. She translated them from German, likely because that was the closest foreign language that she would have been able to study. She could not go to Harvard. Harvard had a modern languages department. She probably could have learned Danish had she been a man. Hans Andersen's Good Wishes for the Children is a remarkable artifact in that it offers us a precious glimpse into the creative endeavors of two talented women of high society. It offered both Bigelow and Putnam an opportunity to get their work published, despite their cloak of anonymity. And arguably, that anonymity gave Putnam a free creative reign in composition that she did not enjoy as a commissioned female portraitist. Good Wishes for the Children deserves a second look, not just because of its rarity, but because of these clearly original illustrations by an artist whose work has been partially obscured by her 19th century status as a quote-unquote lady, read permanently amateur, artist. My discovery of the story behind Good Wishes for the Children was made possible by both the community and the collections available at the American Antiquarian Society. The time has come to celebrate Putnam's and Bigelow's collaboration as the masterpiece that it is. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura, for that great talk. We will have some questions from participants. And I just want to start by saying there are a number of things that really struck me about your talk. But I'd like to just start by asking about the fact that this was a special edition, produced as a fundraiser for the Boston Children's Hospital, which, as you note, had just opened a few years earlier and was undergoing a deficit. And I think was mainly for Irish immigrant children, and just for a small number initially, 20 some beds maybe. children who had traumatic injuries or infectious diseases. But what I find so interesting is that one of the main stories in the book, The Little Match Girl, is about a little girl who comes from the working poor and who peddles matches. And given that the workers in American match factories were largely Irish and immigrant children, girls and boys, who worked these incredibly long hours. And then that millions of children were working in the factories, but then also that the working poor of children are the ones who peddled the matches. And that's what this little girl was doing. And so I guess my question is, did these two women, Sarah Putnam and Addie Bigelow, have any say in what stories were included in this special edition? Because it seems that there is a nice sort of connection between that story in particular and the cause that they were trying to support. Do we know how the selection was made for the collection?
I don't, and see, with Addie Bigelow, as far as I know, anybody from MHS, please correct me. I mean, I don't think her papers have survived. The closest we have is some correspondence of her father, Horatio Bigelow, and that was related to his business. And that's often the case with women in high society. You have to really trace them through their activities. I think that Addie Bigelow, as the translator, and like I said, this was from German, so it was from an intermediate language into English. I think she drove the bus in this whole project. That from just the nuance that I get from reading Sarah Gooll Putnam's diary, it was that Addie Bigelow asked her to do the illustrations, and that Addie really lined up. I think she lined up Riverside Press. I think she lined up Frizzell, who was, worked for Bufford, that she had enough connections to do this. I think that given the reason for the whole book, this charitable act for Boston Children's Hospital, I think that the Match Girl would have been an excellent choice. And I think, and it seems like it was in itself a popular story, that you see it recycled in trade publications of Hans Christian Andersen in the United States at this time between the 1840s and the 1870s. The other stories, besides the Little Match Girl and the needle story, a lot of them are really sad. They're about children dying young. So it would, and you see, this is a time where we didn't have penicillin, right? I mean, penicillin didn't really come along into practice until the Second World War, the 1940s. This is the 1870s. So children of all ages died, but especially children of the poor, the working class, who did not have regular access to healthcare, and even the remedies. Once you got to a certain point in a disease, if you didn't have that type of penicillin drug, you were going to die. So I think that my guess is that because this was a fundraiser for Boston Children's Hospital, they looked to the sentimental of children dying, and like even the people, the wealthy classes. Look, Lincoln's, what is it? 3 of his 4 sons died. And he had access to really good health care, right? And that's in the 1860s. This would appeal to parents across class lines, and especially the very wealthy people who could afford to buy the book. So I think Addie made very smart choices between pathos, sentimentality, religion, and humor. Also, Addie, and I need to do more research. If the best of all possible worlds, but I know that Sarah Gooll Putnam was a Sunday school teacher. She did that, I think, throughout her life. And it could be the Sunday school is kind of this place where it may or may not be attached directly to a parish, and often it was a place for children of the working class to get education. Now, even if she didn't directly teach children of the working class, there would be a lot of emphasis within upper class Sunday schools to do fundraisers to help support these Sunday schools that were directly for people of color and the working class, poor of all colors. So that's a long-winded, and I can tell you that in 1873, December, and the book came out in very late December, 1873, that there was a benefit concert held for the Children's Hospital in a parlor. So this is, wealthy people, and this was put on by young people, and all the money would go to the Boston Children's Hospital, and that they were going to do it again on another day with variations in the program. So this wasn't like the only fundraiser for Boston Children's Hospital that year.
Great, thank you. And just as a quick follow-up, I think you've answered some of what Karen's asking about, if you can say more about selling a luxury version of children's books, which you suggest is not really meant for child readers, but to read for this philanthropic audience, caring for children, more appropriate for women than other charitable causes. Caring for children more appropriate for women than other charitable causes.
Absolutely. Yeah. There again, I mean, this would be, if they were doing a fundraiser to support some, like, I don't know, avant-garde art exhibit, that probably would not go over so well. So I think it was very well put. Women had to very carefully, I mean, who had the means to even do what Addie and Sarah did, they had to carefully position what they did and how they did it, or else, and they had to be above any kind of social suspicion, because there again, their social standing was everything. They were not men going out making money. Their cachet was their social status. Yeah, you're absolutely right, Karen. I mean, this book, when this book was cataloged, like in I think between 1988 and 1991. And so I looked at, I proofread the cataloging of this book, and I thought, man, this is an unusual book. Who is this for? Because nobody in their right mind would put this sort of binding on a children's book. I mean, first of all, it's generously large, really large. And secondly, paper covered lithographic boards, and lithography, it's delicate. Your sweat could really, stain it, and there's water staining on this one. So I mean, I knew right off this was not a book for the family that you go out in a regular bookstore and buy, available, throughout the United States. This was a very, very special book. So yeah, so it is a book put together by the upper class for the consumption of the upper class, but it was supposed to be the money would go help the lower classes in need. So that's the whole trickle down theory of that whole thing.
Yep. Steve is asking, was Sarah Wyman Whitman among Sarah Gooll Putnam's social circle?
Oh my God, I don't know, and that's something I would love to find out. And I bet they were. I mean, because they had
imagine that they wouldn't have
that same class.
I mean, Whitman would have been older.
She would have, by the 90s.
No, she would have been younger, in fact, because she was born in the 40s.
Sarah Gooll Putnam was born in 1851.
They're born in 51. Okay, well, then,
I think they would have been contemporaries, and you're right, they both enjoyed really high social standing. And the whole idea of women in the arts, I'm sure that they rubbed elbows. And I mean, Sarah Gooll Putnam's diary is a treasure chest. It really is. I mean, it's volumes and volumes and volumes, and it's fully scanned. I mean, I think at least the volumes I looked at were now fully scanned online. So I should go back and look at that. I mean, the whole thing, I really wanted to focus on the early career and how this book, because I think a lot of times we don't have the evidence to figure out how or why a book was published, especially something like this. And that we actually, so that's what I chose to spend my time, doing.
Yeah. Well, Lisa is asking about the lettering on the covers of her diaries because they're very unique. Do you think she did the lettering herself?
Yes. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. They're beautiful. Like that one 1874 and oh my God, fantastic. Yeah. No, she was clearly gifted, and it was just so exciting to really be able to look at it both in this digital format. Kudos to MHS for doing that. I mean, that is such a service. And so it really shows how her art really is infuses her life and her writing, and her cursive is fantastic. It's such a dream to read, you know, as one who has tried to transcribe inscriptions by people who have really crappy handwriting. I mean, it's a dream. It really was a dream. Even in the scan, sometimes when things get scanned or microfilmed, the images don't come off so well, especially manuscripts, but that is just, yeah, it's stellar. So yeah, she was an artist. She illustrated, I mean, her book, the volumes of the diary that I examined are full of drawings too, that are just wonderful. I mean, they're just beautiful. So in and of itself, her diary is a work of art.
Yeah, I'd agree. Fascinating. Caroline is asking, did Sarah write and illustrate her trips to the West, as did others like Mary Halleck Foote, perhaps in local periodical newspaper?
Ooh, that's a very good question. I don't know. I mean, and this is a difference between when I first started doing my research in 2010 and now 2021, when I was asked to reprise this talk and really tweak it, is that so many more newspapers have been scanned. And that's how I was able to get Addie Bigelow's obituary from 1915, where I don't think I would have been able to get that so easily back then. So yeah, and by the time she was out doing this sort of thing, my guess, I wouldn't bet on it, to be very honest, because Mary Halleck Foote was in a totally different situation. She had a husband whose salary was iffy, and for a long periods of time, she was the one who supported the family, not only with her illustration work, but with her writing. And so that periodical, you know, her writing and descriptions out west was like a financial lifeline to her family, and she had to do that. And Sarah Gooll Putnam, she might have done it on occasion because she wanted to, but she didn't have to do it. And you see then, and I've had such a great time tweaking this. Fantastic book, April Maston, artwork. I helped April when she did this, when she was writing her book. She came to AAS as a fellow, and what she talks about is the founding of Cooper Union back in the 1850s. So New York was really ahead of Boston in opening the school equally to men and women. So where am I going with this? There was the whole unity, what she called the unity of art idea, where what we would now call commercial art, applied art, and fine arts like painting, so product design and painting, portraiture, were taught on the same level, given the same level of importance by students at Cooper Union back in the 1850s and through at least the 1870s. But what Maston finds at the end of the book is that the unity of art idea was being pushed aside by what is called the art for art's sake idea, where the fine arts were privileged above the applied arts like illustration. And that means that if Sarah was going to spend her time doing anything, and look, her time is filled with teas and receptions and board work and Sunday school teaching, she would spend her time getting commissions for portraits, right? Like Amy Lowell's parents, right? Cajoling them, hey, you want that portrait taken, right, of your daughter, right? That's where she's going to be spending her time. And that's where her work is going to be remembered. And that's why she got exhibited with John Lafarge painting, right? There were equally talented women out there, but they didn't have her class standing. They had to work as illustrators. And so their work, like Mary L. Stone, her work doesn't, largely, this is where Mary L. Stone's work survives, in wood engravings and books like this. And that's why the work I do as a curator of children's literature is so very important. So resurrecting both the Sarah Gooll Putnams of the world and the Mary L. Stones of the world. Okay.
Here, a question here from Nora, who's asking, sort of along the lines of what you were, kind of continuation of what you're just saying. Is there any record of Sarah Gooll Putnam engaging in ladylike craft disciplines such as needlepoint? The telescopic compositions seem to share that quality. And I'll just add, that is something too that kind of, those illustrations to me, you're right, they have a very intimate scale. They're drawn in that sort of circular frame. and you reference it sort of intimate gaze through a telescope. They remind me though of sort of magic lantern slides too.
Right.
And I don't know if there's if you're seeing some connections there in her sketches, in her diaries, but I think Nora's point is a good one about whether she engaged in needlepoint, which of course also would have that circular frame in some cases. So in any sense of whether she took part in those kinds of
I'd have to do more research, but I bet, I mean, as part of a woman being quote unquote finished in the classic sense of finishing school, I mean, needlework would be, I mean, that was definitely an acceptable art that women were expected to know, at least know something about. Even if they didn't do it themselves, the styles of the day of women's fashions from the 1870s and 80s really required a lot of needlework, right? And to be someone who could appreciate it and have an understanding of how it's done and how expensive it might be, I'm sure that she at least knew, she probably, as a young girl, knew something of it and probably tried it. And she was probably good at it if she did it. But you're right, that is a wonderful avenue of exploration. And this is where the Society of Arts and Crafts, I mean, these things are starting to take off in the 1870s, and the whole thing of buying, you know, decorative arts like binding. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And that is worthy of pursuing. I'd love to do it.
Here's a question from Catherine, who's asking how the book came into the collections.
Oh, and this is, I'm going to give a shout out to my friend, Lisa Baskin, who I think is listening. I hold a great affinity, as I know Lisa does, for Benjamin Tye, he was one of the greatest bookmen of the 20th century, and he bestowed his craft, his love, his donations on the American Antiquarian Society. He was a dear friend of Clarence Shipton, who was a longtime director of AAS. You know, he worked at AAS as librarian, then director, you know, for like 50 years. And then the successor, the man who hired me, Marcus McCorrison. So Benny Tye got going, I think in the 1920s, 30s, and he died in 1975. So he had a very long career. And he would go scout out barn sales, bookshop. I mean, estate sales. I don't know where the guy was a genius. He was, and Lisa could definitely back me up on that. The guy was an absolute genius. And whenever I see a book that I think, damn, what a great find. I mean, it's just so many times I would find this book and I'll say, purchase. Benny Tye, you know, Benjamin Tye, 1967. And the thing is, he was a really good businessman in that anything good we paid for. I mean, the stuff that was really kind of ripped up but that was still interesting, he would donate to us. But the guy had to make a living. He did not go to college. He did not go to rare book school. He did not have an advanced degree, but damn, he outclasses me, and I've been at it, you know, for over 30 years. So I've never met him, but I want to hug him.
Well, Lisa says absolutely true. So, Laura, there's something that came up in the chat. I want to just, before I forget, Hans Christian Andersen did send her a photograph of himself. Yes.
Yes.
Just to clarify, that's something that
yes, and it's in
his life. Yes.
Right, and it's in it's in Sarah Gooll Putnam's collection, if you want to. I mean, I was thrilled with the citation, but I didn't go petitioning to look or, you know, finding the photograph. But this is what I think it was sort of like Dickens, maybe. I mean, this is what he did. Mm-hmm. Or Sojourner Truth with her cartes de visite. I mean, this is before people could send, email or anything. I mean, it was like this personal touch. Yeah. And he would capitalize. I mean, he was a personality, so that was a big deal to get an autographed photograph of Andersen. That was like a big deal.
Great, thank you. Elena is asking. She's fascinated by your analysis of the material aspects of the book, and as you note, wasn't meant for children. But she's wondering if you can speculate more about how it may have been used? Would it have been displayed somewhere in the home, sort of like on a modern coffee table book?
Yes. Yes, I do think so. I think that it might have been, when ladies took their tea in the drawing room, that it might be on the table, because this would be a piece of hardcore social status. This was an expensive book, and it shows that these women care, about the poor, and that it was benefiting a great institution, and that it was by their friends, right? Their wonderful lady friends. But also it proves their social standing, that they could afford to buy this book. So yeah, I mean, this book would have a loaded meaning, that we care about the poor. This is aesthetically beautiful. Riverside Press, typography, lots of white space, couldn't beat it. I mean, it was to have a Riverside Press book was at least you had middlebrow tastes or above, but to get this is even a cut above. This is a special book published by the Riverside Press. So yeah, this would be this would be a concrete piece of social status, right on display on your tea table, coffee table.
Do you know where Hans' signed copy of the book is?
That they sent, no. I don't know. And it could be, in Copenhagen. I don't, you're right. That's an excellent question. It could be, but I'm sure people sent him keepsakes all the time.
Sure.
And it's probably vast, but that's probably worth digging. Maybe I'll ask my friend Nina Christensen, who's over there, if she could search for me. I don't know. But you're right. There could be a real transatlantic connection physically.
Yep. Well, I'm just realizing we're out of time, and there are a few more questions left. Just one really quickly. Is there any record of Sarah Gooll Putnam's illustrating games, since you know so much about games?
No. No, this, as far as I know, this book was a one-off. This was her foray into illustration. Who knows, she might have designed ephemera for like charitable organizations. She could have done that. But that all depends on whether the ephemera, which was meant to be thrown away, right? Menus, invitations, were saved by somebody. Right. And we're all dependent on that. But I think she sunk a lot of her energies, channeled it into portraiture, which is what she's known for today. She's hung up at Harvard, right?
Well, Laura, thank you. This has been fabulous. And I want to end on a note that Alan Turetz has put in. He wanted to be able to say this, but I'm going to say it for him. He says, Laura is a truly charismatic curator with a mind renaissance in its scope and empathetic brilliance. So how nice is that coming from Alan Turetz? Thank you, Alan. Way to end. Laura, this has been really wonderful presentation with lots of great information. For those of you who may have questions remaining that are in the Q&A, Laura has agreed to answer them. We'll take note of those and get those to her. So thank you so very much, Laura. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. And do go to our website, AmericanAntiquariansociety.org, to look for other upcoming webinars and programming at the Society. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.